Hi friends, this is Shekhar Srinivasan, and in this video we shall understand asynchronous web applications with C# 5.0 using ASP.NET MVC 5. Now, when we try to understand the traditional application development method, we will have a set of threads that will be maintained within the thread pool. Whenever a request is going to be given, then a thread is going to be assigned to process the request, and the thread will be busy in processing that request. Whenever a further request comes, the available thread is going to accept that particular request and it will try to process the instructions. And the same thing happens. Now, once the processing of the thread and the request has completed, then the response will be given and the thread will be free for accepting further requests. If any other further requests are completed, the same thing happens. Now, in case if a new request comes, the thread will be again assigned for that request and it will try to process the instruction. Now, everything is fine and everything is working out very well. Then what is the problem with the traditional application development is, assume that the request whatever we have, if it takes some long time to process the request, maybe the request has to interact with the database, or the request depends on some kind of service such as web service or WCF service to process the request to get the response back. So the threads which are assigned for handling that request will be busy in waiting to get the response back. Now, if any other further client sends a request, and in case if that particular request also takes some time to process it, then the time when the threads are waiting for getting the response back from the client, the request may come and the request will be in the queue. Now, when I just try to observe that the threads which are present within the thread pool, these threads are not performing any kind of useful work. They are just simply waiting to get the response from the service or from the database. Now, let's try to understand how the asynchronous web request handling method will be performed. Now, assume that you have some two threads present within the thread pool. Now, whenever a new requests are being given, the threads which are present within the thread pool will be assigned for the request to process that particular request. And once the response is being given, the thread will be assigned for the next available request. And once the processing of that has been done, the threads will be returned back to the thread pool. In case if any particular request takes a long time to process, then the threads which are assigned for that request gets detached and it will return back to the thread pool. In the meantime, if any request comes, the thread which is present within the thread pool will be assigned to the request to process. And in case if the long running thread request has been done, a signal will be given and the thread which is present within the thread pool will be assigned to that request to process. Maybe the same thread, maybe a different thread will be assigned and the processing will happen. Once the processing is done, the thread will be returned back to the thread pool, so that if any further request comes, the thread will be assigned back and it will handle. This is how the asynchronous web request handling method will be there, which we can also call it as like a restaurant model, where in a restaurant, if we just try to observe it, the waiter or a waitress will not wait with the client till he have his food or his meals and takes the next order, the way the traditional application does. The waiter comes, takes your request, gives that particular thing to the delivery, and then the waiter will try to handle some other client's request. The same methodology is used for asynchronous web request handling. Now let's try to understand this entire concept practically with the support of ASP.NET MVC. Let's start with the demo. Now let me just try to open my Visual Studio.NET. I simply say File menu, New Project. I selected my ASP.NET Web Application. I say OK. I selected my MVC. Now let's the project gets created. Now the first thing which I would like to do is I need to add a model. So I like it on the model. Click on add class. Let me give a name for this as department. Now I would like to have a property called as an ID, department name, and a property called as location. So once we have this particular thing, I would like to have a database. So I say add class. The name I just provide as myDB. Now this particular class, since I wanted to make it as a database, it has to inherit DB context, where DB context is a class which is present under using system.data.entity. Now I would like to prepare a table. So I say DB set for a schema called as department with a name called as departments. Let us build the solution. Now once the model has been prepared, now our intention is to prepare a controller with the asynchronous support. So let me try to right click on the controllers, add controller. I select a MVC controller with empty so that every operation we can try to perform manually. Now let's try to start from the beginning. I would like to have some couple of namespaces required. So I say system.net, system.threading.task. Since we are going to concentrate on asynchronous programming, asynchronous programming, we take the support of system.threading and also system.data.entity, as we are going to work with the entity model. So the minimum thing which we require is this. Now let's try to have the database which is present under my model, db equal to new my database. Now the first operation which I wanted to support is to list out all the records which are present in my table. So what we do was I say public async task action result, and the name of the action I just mention as index. Now this index has to return me the list of all the data present in the departments. So I say return view, I say await db.departments.toList async. So this is a simple method which is going to return me the list of all the departments asynchronously. Since the intention is to understand how to write asynchronous actions within a controller in MVC5 with the support of C#, the views, let me try to take the support of scaffold to create it. So the template which I wanted to use is list template for a model class called as department, and the data context I am using is myDB. So this is going to prepare a scaffold view for the index action. And in case if you are not aware of what is the functionality of async and await in C# 5.0, please try to watch my video on async and await demo in C# video series. Let's try to execute this to check out that you will not find any records as of now, because this is the first time we are trying to execute it. And when we execute this for the very first time, it takes some time for us to get the response back, because behind the scenes it will create a database, tables and everything, so it takes some time. And once we just observe it, we can see that there is no records available. And the first intention of us is to add a record. So when I click on create, it is trying to search for an action called as create. So now let's try to add an action called as create, which is used for adding a record now. So what I try to do was, let me go back to my controller to provide the actions for adding a record. To do this, I simply say public action result create. I simply say return view of new department. And once I provide the view, whenever the user is going to submit the data, I try to take the support of HTTP post, and I say validate anti-forgery token. Let's try to handle an asynchronous action now. So once the user submits the data asynchronously, it has to add a record. So I say public async task action result. I say create department DPT. Now my intention is to add a record. So what I do is, if model state dot is valid, if the model state of the entity is valid, then I simply say db.departments dot add department, and then what I do is I say await db.save changes. And once I added the record and saved the changes asynchronously, now what I do is return redirect to action. I'm redirecting to an action called as index. Now let's try to create a view for supporting the create option. So I say add view. For this create, model class is going to be department, and this is my context. And one sec, we have not written the view here, return view of department. Let me just do it. Add view, create the template. So I selected the department and I said add. So this is going to prepare a view for adding a record. Now let's try to execute and check out. Now let me just try to add a record. I say sales HYD. I click on create. So we can see that the record has been added for us now. Let us try to add one more record. So I simply say marketing and HYD. I click on create. So you can just observe it, the records are getting added. Now say that if I have a requirement to view this information, I click on the details where it is trying to refer to an action called as details and an ID has been passed. So let's try to have a controller action for retrieving the data based on some ID asynchronously. In order to do this particular task, what I try to do is, in my department controller, let's try to have an action like say public async task action result. I simply say details int ID. Now I just try to check out if the ID is going to be null. Then I simply return new HTTP status code result. HTTP status code is going to be bad request. If the ID is not equal to null, then what I do is I say department dpt await db.departments and I say find async and I pass the ID. If this particular department is going to be equal to null value, then I say return the record not found. So HTTP not found. If it is available, then I would like to return the view with the department. Now let's try to prepare a view for this thing and let's execute. I'm just adding a view. This is for the details, the model classes department, and I say add. Now let me just try to execute this. I'm going to send a request for the index. And we can just try to observe here, once we have tried to project it, when I click on details, I'm able to get the details of the departments. Now if I have a requirement for modifying the data asynchronously, then what we have to do is, I go for the department controller, I say public async task action result, and I say edit int id. Now what I try to do is, once I got the id, let us try to do the same thing. If the id is equal to null, I return a new http status code result, http status code dot bad request. Then I say department dpt equal to await db dot departments dot find async, and I just pass the id. If the department is going to be null, I return http not found, else I return the view of department. Now once we have this particular thing, when the user is going to perform some modifications and if we try to post the data, it will be handled by an action called as http post. I validate the anti-forgery token, public async task action result, and I say edit, I say department dpt. So once I have this particular department, I just try to check out if model state dot is valid. Then I say db dot entry department dot state equal to entry state dot modified. I say await db dot save changes async. Okay, I just make it as lowercase. Now once I have this particular thing, I return to redirect to action index. So once I done with this, I say return view of department. So quite a simple action. So whenever you wanted to modify the data using asynchronous way in MVC file, the way what we can do is this thing. Now let me try to prepare a view for our edit. So I right click on the edit, I click on add view. The template I wanted to use is edit model classes department and my db. Now let's try to execute this once again. So we have this information. Let me just click on this. I try to change this as HYD. I click on save. So we can see that the data is getting updated for us. Now finally, when the user clicks on delete, I wanted to remove the data asynchronously. Now once again, let me open my department controller and let's try to write the code for the delete operation. So what I try to do here is, I just simply say public async task action result, and I just simply say delete int id. Now what I try to do is, if I just say if the id is going to be equal to null, then I say return new http status code result status code dot bad request, and let us try to find out the department. So department dpt equal to await db dot departments dot find async, and I just pass on the id. If department is going to be equal to null, I simply say return http not found, else I return the view of department. Now in case if the user wants to delete this particular thing, then what I try to do is http post, and I just say validate anti-forgery token public async task action result, I say delete, and I say confirm, like I just wanted to have this, so I pass int id. Since I'm just trying to change the name for this thing, I'll try to provide a action for this thing. So I say http post, the action name I just provide as delete. Now I just simply say department dpt equal to await db dot departments dot find async id, and once we got this thing, I say db dot departments dot remove, and we pass on the department. Then finally I say await db dot save changes async. After I save this thing, I once again return back to the redirect to action index. This is what we just tried to do. Now once we done with this thing, for the performance purpose, what I try to do is finally let's try to override the dispose. So I say override dispose, I simply say if disposing, I just simply say db dot dispose. I'm just trying to clear the resources occupied by my database object. Now after completing this, let us try to prepare a view for our DP. So I just right click on this, add view, delete. The template I try to use is delete. The model class is department, I say add. Now let us try to execute this particular form. So when the user clicks on the delete, ask for a confirmation, I click on delete. Now we can see that the record has been deleted. Hope you are clear with understanding how to use the asynchronous programming in MVC file and how to write asynchronous actions to perform the CRUD operations. If you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This encourages me to develop more and more videos. Thank you, yours Shekhar.